Your rapt attention and listening to me. And thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll open up for questions and comments. We have 30 minutes, so you must keep your responses brief, Mark.
Okay,
and likewise for questions. Well, as they make up their mind, can I just kick off to crack the ice, as it were? Trust, you said, is one of the key attributes of good leadership, and that has two important components you explained: competence and care.
Exactly.
Now, can you explain competence? Is that to do with technical stuff, or is it to do with something else?
Look, it's a good question, because it's simplistically, it's technical stuff, but as you're intimating at it, it's wider than that. So there'll be non-technical behavioural competencies which apply. Might be determination, might be or determination, tenacity, planning and organising. So it is wider than technical. Technical is one part, but spot on. You're spot on. It's wider than that. At it.
Okay, good. Now I'd like to go to Gail Anjani Tiwari.
Hello. Good morning. Nice presentation. I'm A.K. Tiwari from GAIL India Limited. You have told about the engagement, and in our
Thank you.
You have told about the engagement.
Yes.
And what we are doing various things for engagement, for our KPA, KPI, for our supervisory controls, counseling, and leadership development. But why in India, as you have given the figure, is 13% is the only top engagement people are there, and others in other countries more and more engagements are there. So can you give some reasons why this statistical data is so low in India?
It's a great question, an important question for everyone in India and any country where it's low, and it's actually quite low in Australia now as well. We know the empirical data is pretty robust, so we know that we can be confident that it is low in India, and much significantly lower than other countries. Bangladesh, I think it's about 30% or whatever. So in the same subcontinent area, it can be very, very much higher. A couple of things, and it's surprising, I think, as you're indicating as well, because there is, when people don't have so many choices and they don't have a safety net, and my understanding in India, you don't have the dole, as we have in Australia, say, so people have no safety net, they tend to be more engaged, they want to keep their job. So why in India? And I think it's because the hierarchical, India has got what's technically called a high power coefficient in terms of hierarchy. If you compare it with other countries, in an organisation, India has a very distinct power status between manager and subordinate. And that tends to make it easier to manage and not lead. And I've given you a pretty good understanding of why leadership is so important. So it's easy as an Indian manager, more easy than any manager, because all managers can fall into this, but because of that high power structure, to fall into just managing, because it seems like you're getting it done anyway. The trouble is, you're probably not. And it's funny, because in Indian culture, you naturally have a high EQ. I see this all the time. Even people who have the high IQ have high EQs. You demonstrate high IQs because the Indian culture is very good at developing that. When it's in a hierarchy, it seems to be left behind, and people experience management more, and then you get low engagement. When people feel managed, they don't get engaged. So that would be a key answer. It's to do with one side, the culture is really helpful. Emotional intelligence is higher, I think, on average in India than most cultures. But on the other side, this power disposition in terms of the hierarchy plays heavily against it.
So hypothetically, if you were to replace your company's culture from being hierarchical driven to one of a task culture where you set up teams and give them independent responsibility, then the engagement levels might rise.
I think you're spot on at it. The only challenge is you've got a little hump to get over, because that is a big change and people don't like change. So the fact that it's changing might just cause it not to be as effective, but getting there, I suggest, is what you want to do. Yes, absolutely.
So
Can I go to, very briefly,
is it the reservation also is the reason for less engagement in India? Reservation?
That's affirmative action, because in a lot of enterprise, you have to have special quotas for the underprivileged.
Yeah, look, that could contribute. It depends how it's done. Yeah, it's a very complex one, whether to use affirmative action or not. There are disadvantages and advantages. It's likely that that will contribute. I think you're right. Yeah. So good point.
Can I go to Becton Dickinson, Ravi Dawar?
Very insightful presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, what is the reason that a high potential associate could be an average performer in his current role?
In his, sorry, I missed
Current
role. In his
So if a person is a high potential, he should be performing at a high, should be a high performer even in his current role. So I'm asking, what's the reason?
Yeah, no,
that he's not?
okay. It is a very important question. The key thing is that what the requirements of the next level up in terms of intelligences, remember I mentioned too high, too low, may well be different, and I showed you that in terms of supervisors versus technical operator. So if their intelligences don't match what's required at the next, the role they're in, but match with the next level, that's where you get that change. There are some people who could be high IQ, very rare actually, high IQ, developed high EQ. Now they will be fine to go up, but most people, especially when they're junior, is either high IQ or high EQ. Nobody's naturally both. The model is really good. The empirical data supports it. What's funny is we train people for 4 years at college, whatever, to be good technically, where I'm just doing something with my performance. And then we promote them with no training where they're affecting 10 people's performance. And often they make not just them perform badly, they make 10 people perform badly. So it's a classic mistake in organizations. We all know that, and I deal with organizations around the world, they know it and they still make the mistake because they don't know how often to give the message, you're a high performer, that's why I can't promote you. And that's one of the key things we help organizations get around in the work we do. How do you get over that?
Can I go to MGC Global, Monish at the back?
Sorry,
Thank you, Mark, for your very useful, insightful perspectives.
Thank you.
My question is, there's a very subtle difference between employee satisfaction and employee engagement. Would you like to elaborate on the correlationship and also perhaps give us an insight on which one better drives productivity?
It's a great question. Very technical. I mean, very insightful. You're spot on. There is difference for sure between engagement between engagement and satisfaction. It's a bit like the difference between happiness and satisfaction. You know, satisfaction, the levels of satisfaction in the UK are high, but the levels of happiness are actually surprisingly low. They're not the same thing. You're spot on. The difference between satisfaction in the workplace and engagement. I guess it's a great question. To try and put it succinctly, is satisfaction tends to keep people in the job. Engagement tends to get people working harder. That's probably the simplest I could do it. It doesn't do that great question justice, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a nice direction.
Very good.
Thank you, sir.
Can I go to Carrier? Christian, right in front.
Hi, Mark. I work for a Chinese company, and just wanted to ask you about your experiences with Chinese companies. My experience is that in China, companies that have a very high task orientation are wildly successful. They don't seem to have too much of the EQ part of it. Is this your experience as well? And is this one of the reasons that Chinese companies globally, outside of China, are perhaps not so successful?
Again, a lovely question, and that's a big question. I'll try and answer it fairly succinctly. I've worked in China. I've run leadership training in China, a lot in Beijing, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. Fascinating working in China. What is great work in India is you speak English actually better than us English so often. In China, of course, there's the language challenge, but even at a senior level, there can be a bit of a challenge. To try and answer that succinctly again, when you've got expectations set, so if someone comes in with an expectation that is low, they can be pretty engaged pretty simply just by giving them the work. And so they've got away with engagement. In fact, if you look at the Chinese engagement, it's very low, it's lower than India. If you look at the recent Gallup, it's lower. They've got away with it partly because people will still abide by it to a degree. But as people get richer, their expectations change and they don't put up with it anymore. You're seeing a bit of the Hong Kong situation. So there's partly that, but I wouldn't bank on it. You know what? The thing that made us successful can be the thing that makes us unsuccessful, and it's a bit of that. The other reason Chinese companies tend to do so well is they are brilliant at complexity and looking at the long game. And they look at the long game superbly. So for a company to be successful, it must do the strategic complexity stuff right, the spiritual intelligence. And Chinese companies, the Chinese culture is very well developed to deal with that. You see how they're going into Africa and controlling minerals, for 20 years down the line, etc. So even though they might not have the details right, they're going in the right way. So I think that's the two key things that are making them successful. But there is a long-term problem if they're not careful with one of the things, which is predicted by what I said, and I think that is a prediction they need to do.
I just want to linger just for a moment more on this point. As Christian alluded to the fact that they tend to be group-tied. You said task, right?
Yes.
So it's very different to the Anglo-Saxon way or the Western way where people are individualistic rather than group-dependent.
Yes.
So you don't need to comply in your culture.
Yeah.
But in the Asian culture, well, Japan or China or Southeast Asia, people do need to fall in line with the expectation of a group. So clearly the approaches to leadership will therefore have to be structured differently.
Yes, I'd agree. I think, again, these are great questions, and I'm sorry if I'm not giving them the time they deserve. I actually think leadership is a human-to-human contact sport. And actually, what makes a great leader is the same in every culture. But we used to get away, I'll take it in the West, you look at the leadership before, they say, leadership's changing. I'd just say, well, the hurdle used to be lower. You used to be able to get away with worth leadership because things weren't so competitive. Now we need to do better leadership. And so Lao Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, had a wonderful saying. He said, when a good leader leads, the people respect and praise him. When an average leader leads, the people ignore him. When a poor leader leads, the people despise him. But when a great leader leads, the people go, we did that ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, I believe that's great leadership in any culture. You need to tweak how you demonstrate that. Because at the end of the day, it's human to human, and we're no different. Culture is an important overlay, but at the heart of it, irrespective of gender, ethnicity, nationality, we are all the same. I have no doubts. My experience, I've worked with many cultures around the world, I see that clearly. So in China, there is a cultural overlay, which means that you need to treat it differently, and the expectation is such that you can't really lead in what in the West I would say would be a higher way of leading, because there is, again, you've got this power difference ratio in a different way to India, but it is very clearly there. So for instance, when I was doing an in-depth course in China, part of it was people giving feedback, and the manager and the subordinate, they're both very senior, were in the same group. I asked the manager to feed back to the subordinate, no problem. The subordinate, who's very senior, male figure, when I asked him to feed back to his boss, he started to shake. He literally started, I don't think I'd have this problem in India, would I? You guys would give feedback. But he started to shake. So there is this strong structure going on, you're dead right. So how you need to do it, but it's where China is, I think, in its evolution, and of course there are great leaders in China and poor leaders like every country on the planet. But where the culture is at the moment, I think some of I would do a leadership course differently, not because great leadership is any different in China, it's just where they're at in terms of the culture and in terms of China. China's developed very fast, hugely fast. I think it would be different. It's a really complex question you ask. It's a great question.
Can I go to Minda Auto, Lakshman?
Oh, yes.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
I often feel distressed when, in India, we very often hear this saying that, we are ruled for the last 200 years, so the only way to lead is by using the stick. So therefore, my question is, in your expertise and your experience, any input from you as to how do we transform ourselves from leaders who lead out of fear to move to leaders who lead out of love?
Okay, it's such an important question for you as a culture and every culture. It's because I would want to be really specific, so I might change that to lead with the stick to manage with the stick. And how do we turn to leadership? Well, it's not easy, because if you start, even with the best of intention, you want to love your people, you care deeply. I sometimes say, because some corporations say, love word, you can't use that, it's taking us too far. So care deeply about your people. It's to show a deep care. Of course, a mother, people get this confused, they go, so I always got to be nice to my people and never discipline them? Well, a mother who loves her child, or a father who loves their child dearly, will discipline them out of love. So it's not you never discipline them, it's how you do it. But that change is critical, and I would suggest to you, it is, if you look at it quantitatively, I gave you the figure that says it's important for corporations in India. 13% will get you, you've done brilliantly as a country, you've massively increased in terms of GDP, and to get further, it's going to help to increase that. Management doesn't, as we just checked earlier in my presentation. So it's changing expectations, and I would be I think, do it carefully and slowly, because if a person is used to just being told what they've done badly, you know, that's the way it's always done, you've done that, and then you come in and you change now, and you start recognizing the reality that they've always done something well, and you start reflecting that reality by telling them what they did well, saying, you know, Rama, I come on in here, I want to give you some feedback. What's Rama thinking? Oh no, big problems here. And then you just say, I want to just tell you you've done a great job, X, Y, and Z. Rama can go, what the hell is happening to the world? You know, and can be very uncomfortable with that change, even though it's a good change. So succinctly, I'd say two things. Again, I'm sorry I'm not answering such a great question, giving it the due justice, but in short, it is do it slowly, okay? Make the change slowly, and be consistent. Be consistent, be clear of your intent. You must love the people you lead. You don't have to love anybody else, but you must love the people you lead, otherwise you can't lead them. It's that simple and that hard. Does that give you a bit of a steer? It's a great question.
Can I go to Team Computers? Ajay?
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
So you see, everybody's talked about the conceptual question. I'll ask you a very real life scenario, right? So in Asia Pacific, some countries like Korea, Taiwan, Japan, the leadership is, so you have a daughter relationship, you have a solid relationship.
Yeah.
Daughter relationship people who the boss is sitting on the top of them.
Yes.
So in my case, finance people are the direct relationship, but sitting in the headquarters.
Yeah.
And the daughter relationships are people who are sitting there. The problem is, culturally, the people are associated, emotionally connected with the bosses who are sitting there. You may be their actual boss. The work itself relates to the work which you actually have to do from the corporate side. But you can never become their leaders, right? Similarly, when I come back to India and work for a company which is a owner-driven organization, everyone is engaged with the leader who's an employer. So what do you suggest for the managers who are actually, sandwiched in between now?
Yes.
So there is, in a sense, there's no question of trust or leadership or love and affection, because there is an overhanging thing happening here. So
what you're touching on is that very important point that leadership is a choice we make, but it's much easier to lead if we're led. If we're managed, it's much harder for us to lead. And so it can be that the environment makes it so difficult for the reasons you explained, and what you described sounds difficult for good reason, and it makes it harder for you to lead. But there's a lovely saying by the writer of Jonathan Livingston Seagull. He said, not knowing the truth doesn't stop the truth from being true. And this is one of those cases. Leadership is love. That's the truth. Now, not knowing this doesn't change it. Being in a difficult situation to do it doesn't change that principle. It gives us a couple of options. I would suggest you try still to follow real leadership and love your people and see the connection. But if the leadership or management you're experiencing, the environment that you're experiencing stops you from doing that, you have some choices. One is, maybe I've just got to get by without leading, which I don't recommend, but it depends on our personal circumstances, or I move organisations. Or let me talk to them, give them a presentation. How's that? That might be another one.
This works well.
So sorry I haven't got a nice, simple answer. Of course, if it was a simple answer, you'd already have done it. You're clearly you're capable, you'd have done it.
No, I think the problem is you find very difficult to engage them. That's the problem. So you have to try really 2 or 3 times to engage those people.
You know, I showed you that model, task and relationship. 2 responses to a subordinate coming to you. Listen and tell. Which goes where? Where does tell go?
Listen.
And where does tell go on that axis? You remember I showed task and relationship? Where does listen go? Where does tell go?
Well, in opposite direction.
Yes, they do. And on that axis, task and relationship, task is about what?
Telling.
Telling, management.
Yeah.
Listening, leadership. How well is it modelled in corporates generally? I would suggest not that well. You know, managers tend to tell too much and not listen enough. Yeah. So I don't know whether this is of any relevance to you, just what I know generally it's true, is that just try actively listening a lot more. Not so, of course we listen as well, but try listening a lot more and just see what happens in terms of people's engagement and how they suddenly might start listening to you. They might not. You've described a very complex, difficult situation. That'd be my advice. Just go out, spend time. It's very inefficient. Efficiency is task, effectiveness is people, relationship. Just go out, spend time listening, and see what starts to happen out of that. One suggestion.
Thank you.
Can I go to Vinod at MMTC?
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
I wanted to request you to dwell a little more on SQ.
Yes.
SQ, spiritual quotient.
Yes.
Specifically, between innovation and entrepreneurship. Would people be innovative but not entrepreneurial? That's something which I thought would be helpful.
Okay, very important question, and you've actually prompted a couple of thoughts I'd like to add to that. So, it explains why entrepreneurs often aren't good at managing companies, doesn't it? Because management is sort of intellectual and physical. Leadership is spiritual and emotional. So immediately you can see why what the reality we experience so often. Great entrepreneurs fail when managing. In terms of innovation and entrepreneurship or creativity, you're right. Innovation and creativity is not quite the same thing. Strictly speaking, spiritual intelligence, if you prefer spiritual intelligence, your high creativity. Now that's a key, essential part of innovation, but really it's also got a physical part. You've got to make something at the end of the day. So funnily enough, you need opposing things to be successful as an innovator. But I do want to take the chance for all parents here, mothers and fathers, because India, your culture is very strong on schooling and academia. And I think that's one of your great strengths as a culture, one of many great strengths of the Indian culture. Just be careful, because if your kid is physical, emotional, or spiritual, maybe university, of course they must go through school for various good reasons, but maybe university is not the best option for them. There are many things that require these other intelligences outside that. And we are most successful when we're passionate, and we tend to be passionate when we use the intelligences we prefer. So I just want to leave that as a little marker for all parents here. Who's a parent who's got the wonderful joy of having children? I love Mark Twain. I must tell you Mark Twain. Mark Twain said, I remember my father quoting it to my brother when he was 15 or 16. He said, Mark Twain said, when I was 14, I thought my father was so ignorant, I was ashamed to have him around. By the time I reached 21, I was amazed how much he had learned in 7 years. The challenge of parenting here. I'm sure you've got the same challenge here. But does that answer your question? It's, innovation's got that physical, and again, what it does highlight is diversity. Used well, a diverse team, as long as you hold them together, will always outperform a non-diverse team. In every way, culturally, ethnically, gender-wise, generation-wise, technical-wise, the lot, and personality-wise. Yes.
I think we have 4 more questions, so we'll try and take as many as we can. Can I go to Boston Scientific, Rajiv?
Okay. Yeah, morning, Mark. I think it's outstanding and insightful presentation.
Thank you.
A lot of things to take away. One piece which baffles me, though you touched upon, some of these things, especially around the authentic leadership. And as a lot of experts and, leaders over the years have stated that authentic leadership is truly built around character.
Yes.
And in today's business scenario, otherwise, it's been a big question mark on multiple people.
Yes.
Versus the style. Because character, if it's built around, it is, a natural, it is something which, people follow blindly. Versus just on the styles, and styles can be picked up. A lot of pieces, what you teach, what you guide, I think can be. So some insights around that.
Okay, and before I do that, because I know some people will have to leave, so I just want to give people the opportunity, and we have 2 books outside, 2 of my books, which are going for at half price just for those interested. One is Motivational Leadership. So as you go out, there's a stand just out to the left, and that's 750 rupees. And also I've only got 3 copies of this book. Unfortunately, I could only bring a few, which explains the findings of Good to Great. Good to Great is empirical, it's practical, it doesn't have a why. Why were these leaders, these 11 great leaders, business leaders? And Jack Welch, as you know, if you read the book, wasn't one of them. There were others who, Jack Welch did well, these others did much better. That's half price out there as well. So if anybody's interested in exploring this stuff further to get more of an insight in the ways that I couldn't cover because of we always, of course, have a limit to the amount of time, then please feel free as you go out, just pick a copy up on the left. But around authentic leadership, I think it can be defined in different ways, and character is one key way that people include. And do you remember I had profit on one side of the axis and I had ethics on the other, and ethics was on the side of leadership. And so without integrity, most definitions of authenticity will include integrity, etc. Now, values are not very trainable. In fact, if you look at task and relationship, you look at head and heart, thinking and feeling, they all overlap neatly on this wonderfully simple but very insightful model. You can train which? Which do you train, your thinking or your feeling? Which of those do you train? Ability or motivation? Which is trainable? Ability, of course. So you can train ability in the thinking. That's important to a degree. You can't train feeling as such. Feeling is affected by a number of things. But what is important if you want to help people express better values is having an environment which encourages them to do so. Having role models that encourage them to do that. And that's the danger of having non-ethical leaders. It goes way beyond just the leader. It goes to the sort of behavior that will tend to happen from good people. It's a bit in the extreme case. It's well known. General Sheridan said, in war, which is an extreme environment, good people do horrible things. That person hasn't changed. It's the environment they're in. And undoubtedly, good people, I don't know whether you remember the case of Cole, the Senator Cole, who admitted in 2001 he suddenly retired, that as a special forces officer in Vietnam, he had gone into a village which he thought would have Vietnamese soldiers in, and Viet Cong. There were none. There were old women, old men, and children. And they ended up cutting open a woman who was pregnant, killing her and the child. They ended up picking up a baby and smashing its brains out. Horrific behavior. Now, I don't believe he was an evil person. What I'm clear about, he was in a situation that tends to breed evil. Now, that's extreme, but it's true in organizations, is you need an environment to help people be authentic. And that's why leadership development wants to start from the top. Does that sort of answer your question in a quick summation? Thank you.
Well, we can just take one last question. So I'll go to Samir Ruchi at HP, and apologies to Abhay and Babita, if you don't mind, if you just stay back.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for a very insightful presentation.
Thank you.
So one of the important aspects of leadership is around relationship building, talking to people, engaging, and that actually showed up on a lot of your charts on the x-axis as well. An introvert would be at a natural disadvantage versus an extrovert in managing those aspects of leadership, right? Relationship building, talking to people, etc. What would be your advice to a person who is an introvert?
Okay, that's a key point. And the question is often thought that reasonably extroverts make better leaders. They don't. They're extroversion, introversion. Extroverts have some advantage in leadership. Introverts have some advantage. So extroverts, as extroverts, we tend to be a bit more active in the leadership in terms of building a relationship. But remember, who are better listeners, extroverts or introverts?
Intro.
And if you look at good to great, most of the examples that they found of really good leaders were introverted. Gandhi, clear introvert. Nelson Mandela, clear introvert.